Mark Carter was a loving father who always did his best for his only daughter, Emily. She was just 15 years old, full of energy, and always had a bright smile on her face. She loved riding her bike, hanging out with friends, and dreaming about the future. Life was normal, happy, and full of little joys, until one terrible evening that changed everything. That day, Emily had gone to her best friend's house after school. They spent hours laughing, doing homework, and talking about their favorite movies. When it was time to go home, Emily waved goodbye and hopped onto her bicycle. The streets were quiet, and the sun had just begun to set. She enjoyed riding her bike. It made her feel free. But as she approached an intersection near her house, something unexpected happened. A car was speeding down the road, much faster than it should have been. Emily saw it coming, but before she could react, the vehicle ran the red light. There was a loud screech of tires, a sharp gasp from a nearby pedestrian, and then darkness. When the ambulance arrived, Emily was lying on the ground, motionless. A small crowd had gathered, whispering in shock. Someone had already called for help, and within minutes, paramedics carefully lifted Emily onto a stretcher. Her bike was broken, and her school bag was tossed to the side. But none of that mattered. Emily wasn't waking up. At the hospital, doctors rushed her into the emergency room. Mark got the phone call while he was still at work. The moment he heard the words, "Your daughter has been in an accident," his heart nearly stopped. He grabbed his car keys and drove as fast as he could, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. By the time he reached the hospital, the doctors had already performed surgery. They explained that Emily had suffered a serious head injury. The impact had caused swelling in her brain, and she had slipped into a coma. Mark listened, trying to understand. But his mind refused to accept the truth. His daughter, his lively, beautiful, unstoppable Emily, was now lying in a hospital bed, silent and still. The doctors were not hopeful. They told Mark that coma patients sometimes wake up, but many never do. "It's hard to say how long she'll be like this," one doctor admitted. "It could be days, weeks, months, or even longer." Mark refused to believe it. He sat beside Emily's bed, holding her hand, whispering softly, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. You're going to wake up, okay? Just hold on." He said it every day, no matter what the doctors told him. Even when they advised him to prepare for the worst, Mark refused. His daughter was still in there, somewhere, and he wasn't going to give up on her. Mark Carter refused to accept what the doctors said. He knew his daughter was strong, and he believed with all his heart that she would wake up. Every morning, before going to work, he visited her in the hospital. Every evening, after finishing his job, he came straight back to her side. He sat beside her bed for hours, holding her hand, talking to her and hoping that, somehow, she could hear him. He told her about the little things happening outside, the weather, their home, and how her pet cat, Whiskers, missed her. He played her favorite songs, hoping the familiar melodies would reach her. Sometimes he read to her stories she used to love, books she had talked about before the accident. He even told her about the day he first held her in his arms when she was born, how she had been so tiny and perfect. The hospital room became like a second home to him. The nurses saw his dedication and admired his strength. Some of them even whispered among themselves, saying, "He's a father who truly loves his child. He hasn't given up, even when everyone else has." But the doctors remained practical. They reminded him that there was no guarantee Emily would ever wake up. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Emily remained still, her breathing steady but without any signs of waking. Mark sometimes felt helpless, but he never let those feelings show. He kept smiling at her, kept talking, kept holding on to hope. Other families in the hospital came and went. Some took their loved ones home, healed and happy. Others left with tears, saying goodbye forever. But Mark stayed, waiting, believing. The world outside kept moving, but for him, time had stopped in that hospital room. One day, A nurse noticed him gently brushing Emily's hair. She walked over and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Carter, maybe you should rest. You've been here every single day." Mark shook his head. What if she wakes up and I'm not here? What if she opens her eyes, scared and confused, and she doesn't see me? The nurse sighed. She had seen many families go through this pain. "She knows you're here," she said softly. "She can feel your love. Sometimes that's all that matters." But for Mark, love wasn't just about being there. It was about fighting for her, believing in her, even when no one else did. Then, something unexpected happened. One evening, as he sat beside Emily, he felt her fingers twitch. It was small, so small that if he hadn't been holding her hand, he might have missed it. His heart pounded. "Emily," he whispered, gripping her hand gently. "Can you hear me?" There was no response, but he knew what he had felt. It was a sign, however small, that his daughter was still in there. And that was all he needed to keep believing. Mark sat up straight, his heart racing. He was sure he had felt it. Emily's fingers had moved. It wasn't his imagination. He gently squeezed her hand, his voice shaking with hope. "Emily, sweetheart, can you hear me?" he asked, leaning closer. For a few moments, nothing happened. The room was silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Mark held his breath, waiting, praying. Then suddenly, he felt it again, the slight, weak movement. Her fingers twitched, just barely, but it was enough. Mark's eyes filled with tears. He turned toward the door and called for the nurse. She moved. My daughter moved. His voice was filled with a mix of excitement and desperation. He needed someone to see this, to believe what he had just witnessed. Within seconds, a nurse rushed in, followed by a doctor. They quickly checked Emily's vital signs, looking for any signs of change. The doctor gently lifted her eyelids, checked her pulse, and spoke softly to her. "Emily, if you can hear us, try to move your fingers again." Mark held his breath. He watched Emily's hand, hoping, waiting. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her fingers moved again, slightly, but clearly. The nurse gasped. The doctor nodded slowly, looking thoughtful. "This is a good sign," the doctor said. "She might be waking up." Mark's heart swelled with emotion. He had been waiting for this moment for so long. He wanted to hug her, to tell her how much he loved her, but he forced himself to stay calm. "How long until she fully wakes up?" he asked eagerly. The doctor hesitated. "It's hard to say. Waking up from a coma isn't like waking up from sleep. It can take time. She might be confused, weak, or even unable to speak at first. But this is progress." Mark nodded, gripping Emily's hand tighter. He didn't care how long it took. She was fighting, and that was all that mattered. The next few hours felt like days. Mark refused to leave her side. He kept talking to her, encouraging her. He told her about all the things waiting for her, the books she hadn't finished reading, the places they had planned to visit, and how much everyone missed her. Then, late in the night, it happened. Emily's eyelids fluttered. At first, it was just a tiny movement. Then, slowly, her eyes opened. Mark gasped, his hands shaking. "Emily," he whispered, leaning closer. Her eyes were unfocused at first, as if she was struggling to understand where she was. Then, suddenly, her gaze landed on him, and in that instant, fear filled her eyes. She gripped his hand tightly, her body shaking. Then, with a hoarse, terrified voice, she screamed, "Dad, help me. The doctor is lying." Mark's breath caught in his throat. His daughter had just woken up after months in a coma, but instead of relief or confusion, her face was filled with sheer terror. Her eyes were wide, her hand trembling as she clutched his tightly. Her voice, though weak and hoarse, was filled with desperation. "Dad, help me. The doctor is lying." The room, which had been quiet just moments ago, now felt charged with tension. Mark's heart pounded. He had dreamed of this moment, of Emily waking up, of seeing her eyes open again, but not like this. Not in fear. "Emily, sweetheart, calm down," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He placed his other hand over hers, trying to comfort her. "You're safe. You're in the hospital. I'm right here." But Emily shook her head violently. Her breathing was fast and uneven, as if she had just escaped a nightmare. Tears filled her eyes as she looked around the room, her gaze darting toward the door, then the machines beside her bed, then back to her father. "No, Dad, you don't understand," she whispered urgently. "Something is wrong. The doctor, he's not telling the truth." Mark's stomach twisted. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he could see the terror in her face. This wasn't just confusion from waking up after so long. She knew something, something that made her afraid. Before he could ask her more, the nurse, who had heard Emily's scream, rushed in. "Mr. Carter, what's wrong? Is she okay?" Emily's whole body tensed. She gripped her father's hand even tighter, her nails digging into his skin. "Don't let them take me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, Dad, don't trust them." Mark's mind raced. Why was she saying this? What had she seen or heard while she was in a coma? He had always been told that coma patients weren't aware of their surroundings. But what if that wasn't true? What if she had been aware the whole time? The doctor arrived moments later, looking surprised to see Emily awake. He stepped closer with a reassuring smile. "Emily, you're awake. That's wonderful news." But instead of feeling reassured, Emily shrank back, gripping Mark's arm. Her entire body was trembling. "Stay away from me," she gasped, her voice cracking. Mark immediately stood up, placing himself between Emily and the doctor. His protective instincts kicked in. He looked at his daughter, then at the doctor, and back at Emily. "Why are you afraid of him?" he asked gently. "Emily, tell me what's going on." Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks. She looked at her father, her lips trembling. And then she whispered something that made Mark's blood run cold. "Dad, I heard everything while I was asleep, and they never wanted me to wake up." He swallowed hard and looked into her frightened eyes. She wasn't just confused, she was terrified. Something had happened while she was in the coma, something she had heard but couldn't respond to. "Emily, sweetheart," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Tell me everything." "What do you mean?" Emily clutched his hand tightly, her breathing uneven. Her voice was still weak, but her words were clear. "I could hear everything, Dad," she whispered. "I was trapped. I couldn't move. I couldn't open my eyes. But I could hear the voices around me. I heard the doctors. I heard the nurses. And I heard them talking about me." Mark's heart pounded. He had always believed that coma patients weren't aware of anything around them. But now, listening to his daughter, he wasn't so sure. Emily took a shaky breath. "At first, I thought they were just checking on me. But then, I started hearing things that didn't make sense. I heard a doctor. His voice was deep, and he always spoke in a low tone, like he didn't want anyone to hear. He kept saying things like, 'Not yet. Keep her stable. But don't rush it.'" Mark's hands clenched into fists. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice tense. Emily shook her head. "I didn't understand at first. But then, one day, I heard him talking to someone else. He said, 'Her case is perfect. We can extend it a little longer.' It sounded like he didn't want me to wake up. Like he was delaying my recovery on purpose." Mark's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced through everything that had happened since the accident. He had trusted the doctors. He had believed in their care. But what if something else was happening? Emily's grip on his hand tightened. "I wanted to scream, Dad. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't move. I was trapped inside my own body, just listening to them decide my future." Tears filled her eyes. "And then, one day, I heard something even worse. The doctor said, if she doesn't wake up in time, we'll have to take further action." Mark's entire body tensed. What did that mean? What further action? His protective instincts kicked in. He turned to the doctor standing nearby, who was watching them carefully. "Who was in charge of my daughter's case?" Mark demanded. The doctor hesitated. "Mr. Carter, your daughter has been through a traumatic event. It's common for coma patients to experience confusion when they wake up." "No," Emily interrupted, her voice stronger this time. "I know what I heard. Someone was lying, Dad. Someone was controlling my treatment, and I don't think it was to help me." Mark's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure what was happening yet, but one thing was clear. His daughter was in danger, and he needed to find out the truth. Mark's heart pounded as he looked at the doctor standing in the room. Something wasn't right. His daughter had no reason to lie, and the fear in her eyes was real. If what she was saying was true, then someone had been controlling her treatment, someone who didn't want her to wake up. He turned back to Emily, gently squeezing her hand. "I believe you, sweetheart," he whispered. Emily's eyes filled with relief, but her body remained tense. She still looked terrified, as if she expected something bad to happen at any moment. The doctor, who had been silent for a moment, cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I understand that you're upset, but coma patients sometimes experience hallucinations or dreams that feel real. It's possible that your daughter is confused." Emily shook her head quickly. "No, I'm not confused. I know what I heard." Mark's protective instincts kicked in even stronger. He had trusted these doctors with his daughter's life, but now doubt crept into his mind. Could they really be hiding something? He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Who was the doctor in charge of my daughter's case?" he asked again, his voice firm. The doctor hesitated, then finally said, "Dr. Reynolds has been overseeing her treatment." Mark frowned. That name sounded familiar. He had met Dr. Reynolds a few times over the past months, but he had never thought much about him. He was just another doctor in a white coat. But now, hearing his name in this situation made Mark uneasy. Emily gripped his hand even tighter. "Dad, I don't trust him. Please, don't let him near me." Mark nodded. "I won't, sweetheart. I promise." Just then, the door opened, and a man in a lab coat stepped inside. It was Dr. Reynolds. His expression was calm, almost too calm, as if he had expected this moment. "Ah, Emily," he said with a small smile. "You're finally awake. That's wonderful news." But Emily's entire body tensed. She squeezed her father's hand so tightly that her fingers turned white. Mark could feel the fear in her touch. "Stay away from me," Emily gasped, her breathing uneven. Dr. Reynolds kept his smile, but something in his eyes was unsettling. He glanced at Mark. "Mr. Carter, I know this must be overwhelming for both of you. Waking up after so long can be confusing. I assure you, your daughter is safe." Mark's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure if he believed that anymore. He glanced at Emily, then back at the doctor. "Then why is she so afraid of you?" Mark asked coldly. Dr. Reynolds paused, his smile never fading. "I don't know, but I think it would be best if we ran some tests to make sure her mind is adjusting properly." Emily's grip on Mark's hand turned desperate. "No, Dad. Don't let them take me," she begged. Mark stood up, placing himself between Emily and the doctor. "No tests. Not until I understand exactly what's going on." Dr. Reynolds' smile faded slightly. For the first time, a flicker of something else crossed his face. Annoyance. Frustration. Mark's gut told him one thing. He needed to get his daughter out of this hospital. And he needed to do it fast. Mark's instincts screamed at him. Something was very wrong. Emily's fear wasn't just confusion. She knew something. And Dr. Reynolds' calm, practiced smile didn't ease Mark's mind. Instead, it made his skin crawl. "I said no tests," Mark repeated, standing his ground. Dr. Reynolds sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Carter, I understand your concern, but your daughter has just woken up from a long coma. Her mind is still adjusting. Patients in her condition often experience paranoia, fear, even false memories. We need to monitor her closely." Emily shook her head, her grip on her father's hand tightening. "He's lying, Dad. Please, we have to leave." Mark turned back to his daughter. Her hands were trembling, her breathing rapid. She wasn't just scared, she was terrified. His gut told him to trust her. He had spent months sitting by her bedside, talking to her, waiting for this moment. And now that she was awake, he wasn't going to let anyone take control of her again. He looked at the nurse standing near the door. "Get me the discharge papers. Now." The nurse hesitated, glancing at Dr. Reynolds. The doctor's smile remained, but his eyes darkened slightly. "Mr. Carter, I strongly advise against that," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "Your daughter needs medical care. Pulling her out of the hospital so soon could be dangerous." "I'll take that risk," Mark snapped. Dr. Reynolds' expression didn't change, but there was a long, tense silence. Then he exhaled through his nose and gave a small nod. "Very well," he said. "If that's what you want, I can't stop you." Mark didn't trust how easily he gave in, but he didn't have time to think about it. He turned back to Emily. "Can you stand, sweetheart?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. Mark helped her sit up. She was weak, but determination filled her eyes. She wanted to get out of there just as badly as he did. The nurse finally brought the discharge papers, and Mark quickly signed them. He helped Emily into a wheelchair and pushed her toward the door. As they moved through the hallway, Mark felt eyes on them. Doctors and nurses glanced their way, whispering to each other. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone didn't want them to leave. When they reached the hospital entrance, Mark took a deep breath. Almost there. But just as they stepped outside, Emily's whole body tensed. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaky. Mark turned his head slightly. And that's when he saw it. Dr. Reynolds was standing near the exit, talking to someone on the phone. The moment he spotted them, he ended the call and gave Mark a small, knowing smile. Mark's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right, and he had a feeling that whatever was happening wasn't over yet. Mark pushed Emily's wheelchair faster, his heart pounding. Every instinct in his body told him to get as far away from that hospital as possible. Dr. Reynolds was still watching them, his expression unreadable. Emily gripped the arms of the wheelchair tightly. "Dad, hurry," she whispered. Mark didn't need to be told twice. He led her toward his car, parked just outside the hospital doors. He helped her into the passenger seat, making sure she was comfortable. As he shut the door and walked around to the driver's side, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder. Dr. Reynolds was still standing there, but now, 2 other hospital staff members had joined him. They weren't trying to stop Mark, but their eyes followed his every move. Mark slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors. He started the engine, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We're getting out of here," he said firmly. Emily let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, Dad." Mark pulled out of the hospital driveway, glancing in the rearview mirror. Dr. Reynolds and the others were still watching, but they didn't follow. Still, Mark didn't relax. Not yet. As they drove, Emily remained silent for a while, staring out the window. Then, finally, she spoke. "Dad, I remember something else." Mark glanced at her. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily swallowed hard. "Before I woke up, I heard Dr. Reynolds talking to someone. He said something about a program." Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. "A program?" She nodded. "He said I was part of it, and that they needed more time before making a decision. I don't know what it meant, but I know one thing. I was never supposed to wake up." Mark's stomach twisted. His worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't just paranoia. Something had been done to his daughter. But why? What was this program Dr. Reynolds had mentioned? "It doesn't matter," Mark said firmly. "You're safe now, Emily. I won't let them touch you again." Emily nodded, but her eyes were still filled with fear. Mark drove straight home, making sure no one followed them. Once inside, he locked the doors and pulled the curtains shut. "We'll figure this out," he promised. "I'll find out what they were doing, and if they come near you again, I'll make sure they regret it." Emily took a deep breath and nodded. But deep down, Mark knew this wasn't over. Somewhere out there, Dr. Reynolds and whoever he was working with were still watching, still waiting. And Mark was ready. Whatever they had planned, he would protect his daughter at all costs.